Hello everyone and welcome back to Backlog Banter. My name is Tucker Hazell and today we are here for Dev Dive, a show where I get a chance to talk to interesting game developers about their games. And today I am joined by Tom Sennett, the creator of RunMan, Race Around the World, a game that just came to Steam last year but actually has a 15-year history that we're going to be digging into today. But first, Tom, I want to thank you for reaching out to me for an interview about this game. The first time anyone's ever done that. Big confidence booster, I'm going to be completely honest there. But let's start with you talking a little about yourself, your history with game design, and maybe a little introduction into the history of the RunMan series, of which you are now sort of getting back into on Steam.
I've been making indie games for 20 years. I started when I was a young teenager. So you mentioned I just put out RunMan Race Around the World. That game originally came out 15 years ago as a collaboration between myself and Maddy Thorson, who went on to make Towerfall and Celeste. RunMan was also featured as a playable character in Super Meat Boy back in the day. Before that, RunMan was in a series of kind of small mini-game, arcade-style games. But RunMan Race Around the World is a full-length platformer. It's inspired by Super Mario World, Sonic the Hedgehog, that whole generation of platformers. So I did RunMan. I also made a game called Deepak Fights Robots, which was an IndieCade award winner for game design. I made a bunch of Flash games in their heyday. I spent a lot of the past decade doing mobile games, kind of small, weird mobile games. Yeah, I'm now bringing a lot of my stuff to Steam, and the first release is RunMan Race Around the World.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. I didn't know that there was plans for other stuff. We'll talk maybe a little bit about RunMan Turbo down the line, but you said a lot of stuff there that I want to get into. But I think it's important that we start off with the fact that RunMan Race Around the World was initially a browser game, a Flash game, something like that, or freeware of some kind, that is now 15 years later being revisited and put onto Steam. And so when did that decision come about and why to put it onto Steam and fix it up a little bit after so long, changing the game that way?
So as you mentioned, RunMan Turbo, that's a sequel to RunMan Race Around the World, which I'm currently working on. And I was sharing progress on RunMan Turbo online, and I got reached out by Pokey.com, which is like an online arcade. They have a bunch of web games. So they reached out about RunMan Turbo and seeing if I wanted to put it up there. And I said, it's maybe not the right time, maybe not the right fit, but I have a backlog of games, and RunMan Race Around the World was one that they were interested. So they gave me some support to hire a freelancer, Katrine Steen. She joined and helped put together a port of RunMan Race Around the World for Pokey's website.
Oh, okay.
The game was originally made in GameMaker. This predates when I was working with Flash, but it was a very old version of GameMaker. So Katrine took the old code base, brought it up to the modern version of GameMaker, which enabled us to easily port it to the web as well as do it on Steam. And it also gives us the option if we want to do console or mobile or anything. Pokey got this thing in motion, and we got the code base up to date, and we got the free ad-supported version out on Pokey in the end of 2023, I think. And so then I realized once we had the code base all up to date, it's like, well, why don't we put this on Steam?
Yeah, of course. That's the platform right now.
When we originally released the game, Steam was closed off. Only a very short list of approved developers could put games up on Steam.
Just shows how much things have changed in the last 15 years.
Yeah.
That feels like ancient history.
I mean, this is before itch.io. This was we self-published the game, and that meant we put it on a web page on my web server, and we said, here's the URL for the game, go to it. Since we had the opportunity, a lot of people played it back in the day and wanted to have it in their library. A lot of people never got a chance to play it. And there were a lot of compatibility issues with the old original freeware version. Yeah, it was a no-brainer to clean it up and get it ready for Steam.
So you've been designing games for freeware, for sharing online for years and years and years, and you mentioned some mobile games as well. And according to Steam, this is your first time putting a game on Steam. And obviously you said that you had some help from Katrina to port the game to Steam, but I'm sure you had some involvement. So how different is it making a game that you're just going to put on a browser versus designing it to actually go up on Steam for public purchasing consumption?
It was actually more seamless than I expected. The actual technical lift to deploy it on Steam is definitely easier than it used to be. And it's definitely easier than the iOS App Store, where you have to jump through a million hoops. People expect a certain quality of experience on Steam. People play games on Steam and it's what they're doing. Like they fire up Steam to like get in the zone and play games, which is very different from like Pokey and like the old Flash games, web portals where it's one of a million things they're doing and they're liable to click away at any instant. Which is its own like fun game design
Of
challenge.
course, yeah.
Similar with mobile, where it's like people are doing it while they're sitting on the couch or they're going somewhere, doing other things in the real world. It's kind of nice in that you can expect people's attention a little more, but again, people expect gamepads to work and to have like the right
Yeah,
buttons
of course.
displayed and all these nice things, which those things are like mostly just detail and kind of tedious, and like no game developer gets excited about doing that stuff, but it makes a real difference to the player experience.
Yeah. So for the majority of this interview, I want to focus on the design and history of specifically RunMan Race Around the World, because that's the game I actually got a chance to play. You're gracious enough to send me a code. I played through it a couple of times. I enjoyed it. I want to talk about that. But I do want to talk about the RunMan series as it existed leading up to Race Around the World's release in 2009. You said you had a lot of smaller, more experimental, quick games that featured the little character RunMan, which everyone can see on your shirt, and also you've been seeing in the footage that I've been editing in. So let's talk about when you sort of came up with RunMan, that character, and why you decided to sort of put him in a bunch of different little small games.
I came up with RunMan, I think I was 14. I was in middle school. I knew I wanted to be a game designer since I was like very young, and I had done some programming like in basic when I was like 10 years old or so. So when I was 12 or 13, I found Game Maker, the original Game Maker by Mark Overmars, which he's a professor in the Netherlands. He developed it as an educational tool. It really clicked with me because I'd also messed around with like RPG Maker, but Game Maker really clicked, and I started trying to make something. At the time, I was a huge fan. Well, I'm still a huge fan of WarioWare, the original Game Boy Advance version. Says they had all the micro games that were the little like 5 second experiences, which I did another game that was heavily inspired by that. But they had like mini games which were a little more substantial. They're things you could play repeatedly. One of the mini games they had was a skateboarding game, and it was like what we would call today an endless runner, where where it's like you're on a skateboard and there's blocks coming, you have to either jump over them or duck under them.
Yeah, like the Chrome Dino game, perfect example of
Yeah, yeah.
that.
So I really like this game, and I basically made a ripoff of that mini game in Game Maker, and I was just kind of doodling. I was a kid. This is on a Windows 95 computer. Like I had like the old family computer, which wasn't even connected to the internet. So I drew with a mouse in MS Paint because that's what I had, and I drew this little character. And originally, Runman was about twice this tall and just had like a really
Okay.
long torso.
Sure, yeah. Now in retrospect, that feels a little odd. Like the skinny Mario from Mario Maker, where he's like really tall and gangly. That gives me that vibe in my mind.
Yeah, it didn't really work, but I had it that way because I made it so you could jump or you could like squat, and
Sure.
you would get so you could duck under things. And the animation where he was squat, I realized looked a lot better, and he was just like star shaped. And so then that became the base of the character, and then he rolled into a ball. That first game, and then I did a couple similar scope games that were all small that had different settings. I did one that was desert island themed for a jam. I did one that was a Christmas game, and I did one that was a little more advanced called Runman's Monster Fracas, where that had like slopes and like dynamically generated levels. But all these things were deliberately small scope because I wanted to ship something. which at the time shipping something just meant like uploading it and posting it on the game maker forum.
Yeah, when you feel you're done with it.
Yeah, I kept it all constrained for these smaller games, and then yeah, when the opportunity to work with Maddy came along, we kind of zeroed in on expanding the scope because Maddy was a fan of the character and the character had a following in the game maker community. People love this world and everything, so we wanted to expand it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a perfect way to transition into talking about Runman Race Around the World. And I'm curious, when working on that game, which you said sort of ballooned in scope in comparison to your previous projects, of course, as you mentioned, you brought on Maddy, which I want to talk about as well. But how long did that first Runman Race Around the World game take to make? Was this a year-long process, a month-long process, somewhere in between? How did that happen?
It took many years. So Maddy and I were both coming up in the game maker community and fans of each other's work, and we had kind of jammed on some stuff together. We worked a prototype for a Metroidvania that we worked on for a couple months maybe, and that kind of fell by the wayside. A lot of that ended up in an Untitled Story, which is another one of Maddy's games. We kind of split, and then we're doing our own thing, and we reconnected at some point, and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about doing a full length RunMan game. Maddy was like, it's a no brainer. And Maddy had some, like, was always working on different movement engines and stuff. And so, like, we started riffing on something there. So this was all like when I was a junior and senior in high school. I think Maddy finished high school. I finished high school. I went off to college. I broke my ankle and I was laid up in my freshman year. That's when I had a bunch of time on my hands and I was like, I'm going to get serious about finishing this game. And then it took another 2.5 years after that.
Oh, okay, wow. Pretty significant scope and time and investment for what ultimately ended up being a Flash game. You don't really think of those being like dedicated projects, but it's really cool that you were able to work alongside Maddy to like put a lot of thought and effort into this being like a big coming out like major project for you guys.
I mean, this was the biggest scope game that I had done, and I think Maddy had done definitely when we started it. And we both shipped other things in between. I posted the other day was the anniversary of Cave Story, and Cave Story, like this was around the time when everyone who was becoming indie game developers, we had this realization that like you could build something of significant scope, that you could build something that would play like the at the time AAA games that we grew up with, like Super Mario World, where it was like huge team of people and everything. All that felt within grasp all of a sudden, and so that's what inspired us to go for it.
Yeah, totally. Talking about you working with Maddy on this game specific, Run Man Race Around the World, what was that collaborative process like? Was that the first time you'd worked with someone collaboratively on a game in this way? And then who handled what? How did you like send assets back and forth? What was that process like?
It's pretty much my first real collaboration. I messed around with some stuff with friends. We were fully remote. Like Maddy was in Canada, I'm in Philly. The basic split up was I did all the graphics. Maddy did like the whole movement engine, kind of the core programming. Maddy did, and most of the level design. I did like the characters and the story, and then everything else was pretty much collaborative. The different elements that you see in the levels and what worlds you're going to and the overall structure, like we all worked on that stuff together, and our process was, I'm trying to remember, I think we used version control. I think we had SVN, but it might have just been Dropbox. It was basically like the postal service, that band. We were like mailing it back and forth. We were both students and had other stuff going on, and so it was like one of us would work on it for a week or two and then pass it back to the other, and they'd work on it for a week or two. And it was very much passing back and forth and like taking turns. There was largely not a separation between what we were doing.
Yeah, sure. I think the game reflects a sense of fun and playfulness that comes from friends just bouncing ideas back and forth, and the kineticism of the gameplay. I think it has a lot of energy to it. But I think what really catches a lot of people about Runman and about most of your games is the visual style. That no one else is really doing games like that. And you mentioned that you were doodling in MS Paint as a kid, and you've managed to keep that, for the most part, your consistent style for your entire career, which I think is a really bold move. And the art of RunMan Race Around the World has this sort of childlike messiness and playfulness to it. And like just like it's like a rough draft, but that's kind of fun. Where did the idea to continue that forward come from? It's just like you're really passionate about that. You saw no one else was doing it. How did you sort of evolve that into being like that's the Tom Sennett style?
Yeah. So it originated from constraints, from having a mouse and not having a pen, and from having like not that many pixels to work with. It's been exciting to me to grow my style like into HD and into stuff that's a lot more dynamic. The things I'm working on now, I'm trying to take my style is built around really simple building blocks, like simple shapes and colors, and putting them together to make something more complex. That stuff's really interesting to me. It's funny you mentioned that no one else is really doing it, because I had some time away from making games, and I kind of assumed that like someone would step in and do what I was doing, but better. Because to me, it's what I see. I make my stuff look the way it does because I put pen to paper and that's what comes out. And I'm like, why isn't anyone else do that? I took art classes, and like I can sit down and really draw. I've been taking a lot of influence from street art lately. Like you see with this stuff, I'm trying to play up like kind of the visual language of that, because there's like whole visual cultures that are just not well represented in games. I used to make comics too a lot, so that's another big inspiration for me. I feel like there's so much unexplored possibility in HD, 2D, hand drawn graphics, because we had the technology to kind of leapfrog over it when 2D started getting higher fidelity and more exciting and everything. It's like it got totally leapfrogged by 3D, and everything
Definitely.
became
Yeah.
3D. And there's definitely obviously other game designers who are doing like hand drawn stuff, but yeah, this is just my rendition of it.
Yeah. Well, I think what makes it special, because you're right, there are other creators doing hand drawn visual styles. I think they usually end up falling into their own camps, which is really quite cool. But is you think about a game that is literally hand drawn, a game like Cuphead, which is very popular and influential and does take that hand drawn style, but it does look like very professionally done. It's very clean. It's very
It looks good, unlike my games.
well, what I was going to say is I think that what your style manages to have is retain that sense of childlike messiness that reflects Runman as a character with a goofy smile and all the funny little characters that are just like eyeballs on sticks behind him. It's a distinct visual style that I think, especially for someone working largely on their own on these games, it reflects a nice scope, because you don't have to polish every single edge. You can be okay with something being a little bit rough, and it means that you don't have to just like scope creep and focus on every asset and everything being polished. That's something that I think people take for granted in what goes into polishing a game. That's actually a lot of the development process, is making things look perfect. But if you're okay with things just being a little goofy, a little rough, a little dumb, then in the best way possible, then that you can iterate a little bit faster. You can work a little bit faster on the level design and like get things done in a more timely fashion than if you really have to spend like granularly tweaking every single bit.
Absolutely. And that it goes back to, my style is informed by constraints. And it's no coincidence that like my style is easy to animate, it scales well, it's very easy to implement in the actual nuts and bolts of game development.
And I'm curious, over the course of you making these games in your distinct visual style, what people's reactions have been to your visual style, to it being a little bit more crass, a little bit more saturated, a little bit more MS Paint, more child doodling. I had some friends that saw me playing the game like, oh, this looks like a Flash game. And I don't know if they meant that as a compliment or not. Who the hell knows? I'm not them. But I'm sure you've gotten a wide range of reactions to your visual style. And is there anything that sort of jumps to mind as like, inspiring you to try something a little bit different, or like, no, I'm sticking my guns?
Generally, it's like people either get it or they don't. And people who get it love it pretty much. And people who don't are really quick to be haters about it. I always lean into it because for me, I feel like when I have haters, I'm doing something right. That it's like I just want people to pay attention. Like if you can just get someone's attention, then like it's winning half the battle. And I also want to call attention, and I think you kind of alluded to this, that my game, like I'm a solo developer, and my game, even though we're talking about a game that was a collaboration, but like my games look like they were made by me because they were made by me and just me. There's such a great opportunity in games and indie games for people to be more like auteurs, for people to inject more personality and more humanity, and like put themselves as a creative at the center of what they're doing. So Deepak Fights Robots was another like messy visual style and a little more psychedelic. And the stuff I'm doing now with RunMan Turbo and with my new game, 1 Million Stars, is very like aggressive and in your face and like tons of visual noise. And lots of people are quick to point this out as like a usability issue. It's not, because it's like it's what I'm trying to do. I try to avoid talking about games in metaphors and comparing it to other kinds of media, but it's a lot like punk rock. If an artist is trying to make something messy, trying to make something abrasive,
That's an option.
yeah, sometimes that's right and sometimes that's what you want. If you have sensitive hearing, you shouldn't put it on and pump the volume. My visuals are not for everybody, but that's okay.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And another thing that is very distinct about specifically Runman Race Around the World, though, I admit I have not had the opportunity to play many of your games, primarily because most of them aren't like readily available, which we'll certainly talk
Yeah,
about in a
I
little
know.
bit.
This is why they're coming to Steam.
Yeah. But one thing I know about Runman Race Around the World, because I played that game, is that it also has a very unique soundtrack to the game, and you're primarily using phonograph, bluegrass, blues, jazz, like there's like scatting lyrics and things. I'm like, well, this is totally unique, and I that is my favorite part of the game. It's just like running through these goofy worlds and listening to these like banjo sounds, sound like it came from West Virginia. I don't know, and I'm like, no one else is doing this. And I really respect that. And so talk about the music style choices to make this kind of game with that kind of soundtrack that at face value, I don't think the two really match up, or like most people wouldn't expect them to. But because this is you making the game and these are two very distinct creative decisions, I think they harmonize in kind of a fun way.
I do too. The music was, as once again, born out of constraints of, I mean, I love music and I listen to music all day when I'm working on stuff. I listen to music with lyrics. I listen to music that has people singing like while I'm writing code, which most people like don't like doing that. But I've always felt playing games that there's missed opportunity to have music. Like there's so many games where I turn off the music because I want to listen to real music. Like I want
Sure.
to
Yeah.
listen to, you know, indie rock or hip hop or something, and like I don't want to listen to chip tunes or whatever, MIDI orchestral, whatever it is. So I knew I wanted to try and integrate like music that I would listen to outside of the game. I knew I wanted that to be part of my style. And when we're starting out, everyone's like trying to come up with stuff to put in their games. You're picking up asset resource packs of sprites and like sound effects and random stuff.
Yeah, of course.
And people start talking about where else you could source assets from. And it's like, well, there's a bunch of public domain stuff.
Of course.
If
Yeah.
anything, yeah, if anything was made, you know, for a government organization, or if it was made pre 19 whatever, like it's public domain. And there's all this stuff with expired copyright. So I started digging and found a couple sites that specialized, that would like rip phonographs and upload MP3s, or just archive all this like old music that nobody was taking care of. And uh, I started listening to that stuff and trying it in the game because I found some of the stuff was high energy. Like you mentioned There's fun like bluegrass stuff that's all it's music that's made for dancing. So it's a natural fit for a high energy kinetic game like Runman. I'm still doing this. So for Runman Turbo, it's soundtracked by bands from Philadelphia. So it's all like similar genre hopping of kind of incongruous stuff that ends up going together. Like there's ska, there's funk, there's hip hop. There's all kinds of stuff. It's higher fidelity than phonograph music, but still trying to stay true to the spirit.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite parts about the indie scene in particular is that you are working within constraints and that you want to find new ideas where other people haven't found them before. I think that that is a really creative solution to not needing to write your own music, but finding music in a source that other people weren't using it in their games and no one else was pulling phonographs to put them as the
Yeah,
music in their Flash game. I mean, that is a really crazy, bold choice. And I was talking to the creators of a recent horror game called Mouthwashing, and they did something similar where there's a sequence in that game that is using public domain TV clips and film clips to like, and they like mess with it and they like garble it and it like it makes a really unsettling horror tone. And it'll be interesting to see over the course of decades as more and more things become public domain, and especially more and more things that are digitized, that are a little bit more popular, what people take inspiration from in their indie games to use as assets, because there's gonna be a ton of artwork. Oh, and another actually example, I talked to Joe Richardson, a guy who makes these point and click adventure games that are done in the style of Victorian paintings, and he takes the painting assets and clips them out and he animates them and stuff, and it's like all three of these games, all three of these creators, you included, are using pre-existing work, but turning into something that is distinctly your own and evolves the art form in interesting ways. And so, I mean, I don't even know where I'm going with this, but I'm excited to see more people do that in the future because I think it's kind of rare, but I've just pulled up 3 examples out of the 14 developers that I've talked to already. It's like, hey, we're working with some pretty good numbers there.
yeah. Well, it's another thing that I'm like, why isn't everybody doing this? Why doesn't everybody find stuff to rip off? I encourage game designers to incorporate other work they love and like not just limited to public domain stuff, but because there's so much amazing stuff out there that you can put into your game, and most times you just have to ask. Like there's so many great musicians, so many talented visual artists, writers, like whatever, where like you can take their work and incorporate it and give it new life in a game. Most artists are jazzed about that. Like they think it's awesome and like will happily let you do that. It's great that there's resources that are public domain and copyright expired or whatever else, and you can just go and use them. But again, I encourage all game designers to just go for it and try and crib from wherever, and yeah, make something new.
Totally. Yeah, let's talk also about the fact that this game, Runman Race Around the World, has been around for 15 years, and as you mentioned earlier, has built its own interesting community of people that enjoy it and that it clicks with. And so I was curious, as this game has been around for so long, how that community has grown and changed for Runman, for this game over the course of 15 years, sort of culminating in the fact that that this game is now available on Steam and Runman Turbo is also in development. And so, do you have any interesting stories about the community, about people that have enjoyed Runman? Maybe also any games that you might have seen that Runman inspired or creators that Runman inspired? What's that been like watching a community form around your games for over a decade at this point?
Yeah, it's been cool to bring Runman back because people remember him, and people. Well, it's cool because a lot of people forgot about him, and now that he's back, they remember him.
Tooling around the internet trying to find as much information about this game and you as I could. Every time I went to a website that was referencing the fact that it's a Reddit thread. There's obviously a Steam page, Steam reviews, things like that. People doing reviews of Runman Race Around the World, Steam release, and always there's a comment of like, "Oh shit, I played that when I was a kid, and I totally forgot about it, but it's back, and I had a great time with that. And now I can revisit it." And so, yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of that.
Yeah. So that's been cool, and especially because a lot of people revisiting it feel like it holds up well. We would get messages from people throughout like the past 15 years of just like thanking us for making the game, that people would brighten their day or they like connected with a family member over it. those messages are really awesome. And some of those, like, there have been times where I haven't been excited about making games, and where I've like wondered if it's really what I want to be doing. And hearing stuff like that is just a great reminder of what it's all about. I've been really blown away and humbled by all the game designers and developers who said that this game specifically inspired them to try making games.
Sure. Any examples?
The guy made Dino Run and Pizza Tower. They both cite as inspiration.
Awesome.
It's been people who like are actively making games now. Like there's people who are employed in the games industry who like got into making games because they played our game, and that's really cool. It goes back to it having this messy childlike aesthetic, and kind of like showing its personality and showing how handcrafted it was, that like it made people say, well, I could do that. That's really powerful, and like I said, humbling. Really cool.
Yeah. Another element of the legacy of Runman that you alluded to earlier is that Runman was featured as a secret playable character in Super Meat Boy, which is obviously a game that has become immensely popular and iconic in its own right over the course of, I mean, well over a decade at this point. And I'm curious what that process was like of the character appearing in the game, being reached out to by Team Meat, I assume, but they asked your permission to put the character in the game. And then also maybe how his appearance in Super Meat Boy has affected the legacy and popularity of that game.
RunMan got into Super Meat Boy. Edmund was a fan of Maddy's stuff. That's why Ogmo's in there, and a fan of RunMan. Like Ed McMillan has done so much for indie games and for the indie game community, and it was like just one of many things that's his style, where it was like they brought in all these characters, and it was an opportunity to shine a light and elevate other members of the game community. And that's what Super Meat Boy did for us, for RunMan. I worked at a agency in New York a while back, app development agency, and I walked in on like my first day of work and introduced myself to a coworker who's also product manager there. And I mentioned that I was like a game designer. And then later in the day, I ran into him and he was like, "Wait, you made RunMan?" I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "RunMan was in Super Meat Boy. Like, you did this?" I was like, "Yeah." It's really cool to have that kind of name check credibility, where when I meet people in the real world, and like we get to talking about games, if I say like, "Do you like indie games?" and they're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "You know Super Meat Boy?" It's like, "Yeah, I know Super
Yeah, of
Meat Boy.
course. Yeah.
Everybody knows Super Meat Boy." And yeah, so, and like people, I mean, people realize that they played as RunMan in Super Meat Boy. And he's actually like completely OP. He's one of the
Oh,
best
really?
players. Yeah, he's like game breakingly fast and can like fly basically. Super Meat Boy, like awesome game, deservedly loved. Like I'm totally grateful to Ed and Tommy for including him in the game and contributing to the legacy.
Another element of Runman is this game is fast. It is kinetic. You are bouncing off of walls. You are going at a million miles an hour. And the game also very heavily incentivizes speedrunning through the combo mechanics and through the flow that you get once you learn the level design. And I'm curious for you, are you a speedrunner yourself? Were there any games that you speed ran? Is that the word? That went into influencing you to design a game that's very speedrunnable like this? And what went into making the game speedrunnable?
Myself, I'm not really a speedrunner. I never did it like competitively or anything. I played a ton of emulated games on like NES, SNES.
Yeah, who hasn't?
Yeah, and there were definitely games that like I loved and I played multiple times and got good at going through them really fast. So we were inspired by Sonic the Hedgehog. We both liked Sonic the Hedgehog. We both were really more Mario fans. The original Sonic the Hedgehog games, like Sonic 1, 2, and 3 on the Genesis, in our heads, they're like fast, flow oriented, and like you think of Sonic zooming through. But if you actually go back and play those games, it's really difficult to actually get through levels
Definitely.
quickly and smoothly.
Yeah. And those levels also are like all over the place. Like in Sonic 1, it's like, okay, Green Hill Zone, yeah, then you go Marble Zone or whatever the second one is like, wait, this sucks. I can't go fast at all.
Yeah, yeah. That's the design of the game, and like that's the challenge. And games were harder back then. But we wanted to make a game that was like the concept and the feeling of that, like what you wanted Sonic to be, which is really fast and flow oriented and all this stuff. And honestly, like where we ended up, it plays more like um, Mario with a star.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely.
So Maddy pointed this out to me when we were making this game about how most of the levels in Super Mario Brothers and 3 and Super Mario World are designed for you to run through them as fast as possible, like to hold down a dash button and keep going. And that like if you play that momentum, it's easier than trying to like stop and start and do each little platform. That kind of gave us the template and like the ethos we wanted to build around. So Maddy already had a reputation for making really hard games at this point with Jumper and some other stuff. And I wanted to not make a really hard game. I wanted to make like something that was accessible and could be played by everybody. That kind of tension was very complimentary, and like it led to the game has this really intricate and specific layout to the levels that create these opportunities for like really fantastic feats of skill that when you like pull off a perfect run. Uh, but it's all couched in this gameplay system that's extremely forgiving. If you just want to play for fun and not worry about speed, you can still have fun because you can't die and because it's so easy to go fast. That tension is very complimentary. It's like the core of what makes the game fun. It's as easy or as hard as you want it to be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I also appreciate that you don't have to get any specific high scores. You don't have to get any specific medals to progress in the game. One thing that annoys me when I revisit some games is if there are optional collectibles or medals or whatever it is, and you have to get them to like move on to the next world, and then you have to just sit there and like go back to levels. Like, I don't want to do this again. I want to see what's next. And of course, that's different appeals for different kinds of players, and there's certainly a balance. I talked to Joseph Gribben about a game that he made called Grapple Dogs, in which you do have to get a certain amount of medals, and he explained the rationale behind it. I'm like, okay, I understand that. You know, you're incentivizing exploration in this way, and you got to balance it with the players. But I'm also a guy that I want to move on to the next thing. I want to see the game through to the end. And so when I was playing RunMan, it felt like the kind of game as I saw that you were able to get medals. I'm like, oh, at the end of World 2, I'm gonna have to like go back and replay the second level a couple times to get a silver medal or whatever it is. But then I didn't have to. I was like, hey, that's kind of nice. And so, but also the game does certainly incentivize and like you get unlockable characters and things if you do chase those high scores and chase the there's both high scores and high times, which I think is an interesting system. Talk a little bit how that works in the design of the game.
This is one piece of the game that I think is a little over designed. You're trying to get a good time, but you're really trying to get the best score. And you get the best score by going fast, but you also get the best score by keeping up your momentum, because you have to keep your momentum going in order to get a multiplier, so that like you get points every checkpoint and then it gets multiplied and you get points for hitting enemies and all this stuff. It was heavily inspired by Guitar Hero.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, which I was big into like freshman year of college. Guitar Hero has like this great system where you get going on a run, and if you keep hitting all the notes perfectly, like it stacks
Yeah,
multipliers, and
like the
then there's
turbo
like
mode or whatever.
yeah, you hit the whammy bar, but the whole thing just feels really good. It's like feels so satisfying when you hit all this stuff perfectly. And so that was something I wanted to replicate in RunMan. And so that's why I was like, all right, well, we're going to have a meter, and the meter is going to go up when you're moving. You got to keep moving, keep the meter up, and that'll have multiplier and all this
It's
stuff.
like the Mario 3 little P meter up in the corner, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the new game, the sequel, RunMan Turbo, I got rid of points completely, and it's just time. It's just get to the end as fast as you can. So the scoring system in Race Around the World is a little obtuse, but it works. The effect is that like when you pull off a perfect run, you get the best score, and like a perfect run is you go and you don't stop. It makes it work. It works for the replay value and the extra challenge.
Definitely. There are two things that I want to ask you before we close things out. Number one is the insistence in the marketing, I guess, of this game, of Runman Race Around the World, that it's not fun to die, and so Runman can't die. That is on the Steam page, that is on your website, and I thought that was a funny thing to like continually insist, and I'm curious where that idea came from and how far into development you were when you're like, this is like a thing about our game.
Yeah, very early. And this is another thing where I don't understand why everybody's not doing this. That like, and actually, the trends went completely opposite of where I was trying to go because now everything's a roguelike and you
Yeah,
die a
true.
million
Yeah.
times. It ties into what you were talking about with the progression. One of my game design tenets is to avoid gates, like avoid gatekeeping. To me, it's something that turns off so many people from playing games. When I was a kid growing up and trying to get people to play games with me, because I played tons of games and I'm really good at games, and like it would be easy for me to progress through games and meet the challenge. But people who don't play games, when like they get faced with challenge, are oftentimes like, screw this.
Yeah.
Like I'm not.
Yeah. I got other things to do with my time.
Yeah, and I mean, there's been the rise of like cozy games and stuff that's like uh, kind of less confrontational, and but to me, there's this huge chunk of gaming's DNA that's artificial padding
Hmm.
of
Yeah, I don't disagree.
it comes from the very beginning
Yeah.
of
Arcade
gaming's
design.
history. Exactly,
Yeah.
it comes from trying to get people to
Quarter
feed more
munching.
quarters.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's why there are lives in New Super Mario Bros. U on the Wii. It's like, what are you talking about? That's not useful at all. Get out of here.
yeah. So like those game design conventions, they came from a place of making it work for the game designer and like making the game work from a business standpoint.
Yeah.
And they're not useful for making the kind of art that I want to make
Yeah,
with my
sure.
games.
Totally fair.
The games I'm working on now, I'm like, well, I want to have these things that are unlockable. And I'm like, what if I just unlock them? What if they're just unlocked? And what if you can just play with everything rather than having to sink time in? Like, I hate when I sit down to play Smash Brothers on somebody else's machine and they don't have all the characters unlocked. Again, it's all just about padding it out and being. And there's still like this obsession with gameplay hours that's it still like drives tons of people's buying decisions, and I try to exercise that stuff from my games as much as I can where I can, which is part of why my games are like easy to play through and relatively short.
Yeah. No, and I definitely appreciate that. It had led to me playing through Runman twice. I did it when you sent me the code a little over a month ago, and then I played through it yesterday. And I realized on the second playthrough how much better I was at the game. Like I kept remembering back to the first time I was playing it, there was a couple levels where I had to keep trying over and over again. I didn't understand like how some of the level elements worked. But on the second time, I guess I'd internalized them, and I was just like flying past things like, oh hey, that's a lot
Yeah,
more fun. And so I do think that I share that same emphasis on flow and avoiding gatekeeping and things that made me really enjoy Runman Race Around the World. And the final question that I have for you is about what you learned from Runman Race Around the World, and you can pull from other games as well. But for this one in specific, what you learned that you might apply to you being a professor of game design at Drexel University, which I looked up and I saw on your website, and I wanted to ask you about it. Is there anything you learned making this game that you then part to other people?
the biggest thing I learned making this game, I learned from Maddy, and it's to have a plan. It's to think about structure. When we started making this game, I had never really done level design. Because I had focused on arcade games with randomly generated elements, like arena. So I was pretty intimidated by the prospect of designing out full scrolling levels, and Maddy did most of the heavy lifting for the first couple worlds of the game, and I was kind of watching and learning. And if I was doing it by myself, I would have just thrown down random stuff randomly everywhere. And Maddy didn't do that. Maddy had a vision for every level and the pieces that went into that level. And one of the biggest things was just giving every level a theme. So like a gameplay theme where this level's about these spiked enemies, and like this level's about the vines or whatever it is, and we would have like all kinds of elements mixed in a given level, but like each level is pretty much about one thing, and you'll see one element that gets repeated throughout that level. When you stack this all up over the progression of a game, you get a bunch of coherent statements about this level is about this kind of game. Like it's about running through walls, or this one's about jumping, or this one's about wall kicks, or like you kind of dive deep into each of those pieces. And then the effect on the whole is that you get more than the sum of its parts. Like you understand each part deeper, and they come together to make a bigger whole, and it's more effective than just spreading that stuff all evenly. So like when I went and did Deepak Fights Robots after this game, it was like, what's every level about? What's every world about? What's the overall progression? And it's something I brought to all my games. It makes all my games tighter, and it's something that separates good design from great design. You can do good design just on feel, but great design, you need structure.
Yeah. Yeah, totally makes sense. And I like the way you ended that. It sounded very focused, got it straight down the line.
Professorial.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. A little bonus question. Going into the year 2025, of which we're barely a week into, you've got quite a few plans for returning to game development and putting out all sorts of projects, as RunMan Race Around the World on Steam just came out a couple months ago. And you've got some other things sort of in the hopper that you're working on, a couple of which you've mentioned here. Is there sort of a timeline or a plan that you want to share with people as we close out here?
2025 is going to be a big year for Tom Sennett games.
Ooh.
I've mentioned the sequel to RunMan Race Around the World, which is called RunMan Turbo, and that game is up on Steam. You can go and wishlist it now.
Already did my part.
Awesome. RunMan Turbo is going to be a randomly generated multiplayer racing game. There's lots of playable characters. There's power ups. The levels play different every single time that you play.
Very cool.
So that's in progress. You'll hear more about that later in the year. I also am porting slash expanding two of my other games. The first was called Ultralight Beam. It's now called 1 Million Stars, and this is an endless arcade inspired top down kind of shoot 'em up, but there's not shooting. And you have to collect stars and avoid monsters, and you get stackable power ups that let you go faster or stun enemies, stuff like that. There's multiple playable characters. This is going to be 4-player local co-op, and the goal of this game is to collect 1 million stars cumulatively. Every time you do a run, you're banking a bunch of stars, and you need to get to 1 million total. That Steam page is going to go up soon, and you can wishlist it, and hopefully that'll be out sooner than later. I'm hoping to have that in like Q1, early Q2.
Oh, excellent. Wow.
The other game that's coming is a port slash expanded version of Hugby, which is my teddy bear football game where you draw your own plays.
Been waiting for one of those.
Yeah, right. So yeah, Hugby was originally a mobile game. Both Hugby and 1 Million Stars should be coming to both Pokey and Steam. So look out for the Steam pages for those soon. And beyond that, I'm not making any other promises. Those are the three big things on deck for 2025.
3 projects is a lot for one guy, and of course some support to handle, and I'm excited to see you sort of diving full back into all of this. I'll be checking out all of those games, and Tom, I want to thank you very much for not only, as I mentioned, reaching out to me for an interview, but also just being a chill guy that I got to talk to about games for an hour with. And everyone go to the description where I'll have the link to not only purchase RunMan Raids Around the World, which I do recommend. It took me a little under an hour to beat, but of course, again, lots of replay value there. I think it's very much worth the price. But also to wishlist RunMan Turbo. Maybe if I remember, I'll go back and add the other games when they get Steam pages to the description. But explore Tom's games, enjoy his art, and keep your eyes on Tom Sennett games for 2025 and into the future. Tom, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Tucker.
Balance all, Jet. Swing your partner. And round 4.
Come back, get paid. I got my girl.